Good evening, everyone. It is 5:50, and I'm calling to order the workshop of the Victoria City Council. Our workshops are informal, so we're going to dive right into our agenda as we're running just a tad bit late this evening. The one item on our agenda this evening is an overview of tax increment financing, or more commonly referred to as TIF, and an overview of the finance related to the proposed TIF number 1 through 8 for the Downtown West apartment building. Presenting this evening is our financial advisor from Northland, Ms. Tammy Amdahl. Ms. Amdahl, welcome. We're going to have Tammy run through this presentation, and we'll hold our questions to the end if council is agreeable to that. I'm seeing yes, nods all the way around.
Okay.
Welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be here. Mayor, City Council, Tammy Amdahl from Northland is introduced. This is a hybrid presentation. It's both, I will call it a TIF 101 at a very high level, and because later tonight at your regular City Council meeting, as noted, you do have an agenda item related to establishment of a new TIF district. So I will go through the presentation for the sake of time. We'll take questions at the end, and any questions we don't get to Mayor and Council, we can cover at the regular meeting as well.
Sounds great. Thanks.
So as noted, you did receive, or the city did, an application from Anderson Companies to establish a redevelopment TIF district, and I'm going to talk about the different types of districts, but in this case, it would be a redevelopment TIF district. It's a proposed mixed-use building. As the council just sat through, the planning commission was reviewing approximately 144 residential units along with a covered parking, structured parking. TIF assistance for that specific project, and TIF is project specific, so it's not a general area, would be to reimburse approximately $3.8 million of land and site improvements on a pay-go basis. We're going to talk about what pay-go means in a moment. From 97% of the tax increment that would be derived from that new development in that area of the city. The city would retain 3% of the TIF to cover administrative costs. And then after the developer would be reimbursed, the city would retain increment at 100% to reimburse or to use for other redevelopment. Again, during workshop, I'm going to be very general talking about that application. When you get to your regular council meeting, we'll get into more specifics on that. A TIF district is always a geographic area. Depending on the type of district, determines how large it is, what type of land use is within. With a redevelopment district such as this, there is some green space, as you can see, but there's also existing structures that were found to be substandard in the report that was prepared for the City Council. So now I'm going to back away from talking specifically about the development in Downtown West and just talking about tax increment financing. So TIF is really a method to capture the increase in property taxes from new development. You are, as the city council or as an authority, sometimes cities administer TIF districts through an economic development authority, but in Victoria, the city council is being asked to consider this and to administer it. And with TIF, you are able to capture the increase in all of the local property taxes with the exception of the school referendum tax. Any increase in valuation that generates new revenue to the school district goes to the school district. And in the case of commercial property, there is a state property tax that commercial property pays. That tax cannot be captured within TIF districts. Tax increment are generated from the increase as we talked, but there's also a fixed number of years. A redevelopment district, such as being proposed for Downtown West in that specific project, would be a redevelopment district. That's 26 years. From there, there's I'll call it a redevelopment district light, that is 15 years. Economic development districts, which are for manufacturing, industrial, are much shorter at 9 years. And the other type of TIF district that the city has established within the last decade is a housing district, and that is also 26 years. While the proposed development in Downtown West is a housing project, it is not being established as a housing district. It is being established as a redevelopment district. It will be market rate housing. Under Minnesota law, TIF housing districts are for affordable housing. Property taxes which is the increment attributed to the increase in valuation, are used to finance certain eligible project costs. Development costs are incurred up front. TIF is generated over time as property taxes are paid. With respect to TIF, TIF is only provided if the city council makes the finding that but for that tax increment financing and that revenue to assist with that development, that a project would not occur. And that term is in state law, that but for that TIF assistance, there wouldn't be any new taxes to capture because the project would not be feasible. And that's always a finding that the city council and sometimes an authority makes when establishing a TIF district. So that will be on your agenda later this evening with respect to that specific district. How does it work? Property taxes on the base value. So here we're in downtown West as an example, we're talking land in some existing residential property. The current taxes that are generated off of that existing property become the base value. And some might have a question if you were asking questions, well, Tammy, city owns part of that, that's tax exempt. When a TIF district is established, the county still values tax exempt property, it's just not presently generating taxes. That base value that would have been taxable, that is not captured for increment. That will continue to, those taxes off of that land will go to the respective taxing jurisdictions. The difference between the base value and the new value, that's the increase in valuation where tax increment is generated. Here's an example, and this is specific to the downtown West one. So just under 30 million of projected taxable market value from that project. The existing building and land, we estimate, including once the county allocates the city portion that would be sold for that project, at about 700,000. That's 700,000. The taxes off of that will go to the respective taxing jurisdictions and cannot be captured. It's the increase in valuation above that and the taxes that would be generated in the future that would be captured to assist the project if this district is established. Here's a chart, and I just want to focus to further illustrate this point. So on the left, the taxing jurisdictions, city, school district, Carver County, and then other taxing jurisdictions, the Met Council, mosquito control, etc. So that existing 700,000 estimated to generate about 4,000 in property taxes that would go to those jurisdictions. Future, in the middle column, future annual taxes received after the establishment of the new TIF district, as an example, will be 73,000. The reason for that increase, fairly significant, has to do with the school referendum tax. As I noted, that would not be captured, so the school taxes would go from just under 2,000 to about around $65,000. That would go to the school district after that project is completed. On the far right, the amounts in those columns, that is the projected tax increment that would be captured and available. That is an average annual amount, as an example. The sole purpose of this chart is just to illustrate increment. Increment is the taxes off the increase in value, base value. That value and the taxes that are generated from that go to the respective taxing jurisdictions, including the school referendum.
Just so that we're clear.
I can tell you have a question, Mayor. I'm fine to take a question if you're.
Go ahead.
Just to clarify,
Councilmember
this is what we get all the time, is we're taking money from the school. I've heard this question in this room before. We're not taking money from the school. Actually establishing this is giving more money to the school based on your model from what I'm seeing here, correct?
That is correct. And twofold, meaning the council will make the finding that if you were of the opinion that this project or any project that was being considered for TIF would proceed as proposed without the TIF, then you wouldn't approve it. The whole concept is but for that tax increment financing that a project as proposed would not move forward. I often say it doesn't mean any development may not happen on a particular piece of property. It's just that that project as proposed would not move forward without the TIF.
Thank you.
A lot of numbers here. I'm not meant to read this. What I'm trying to do is illustrate a point in this chart. So we're talking about TIF in generalities, but this is specific to TIF 1-8, and you're going to consider this later. And I'm going to actually have you focus on the far right column. This is an example that If in the end, the negotiation with the developers were, in order for this project to move forward, $3.8 million reimbursement of costs, that's on a present value. Presently, it is projected that that 3.8 million would be paid by year 15 of a 26-year TIF district. Earlier, I had made the comment that the city would initially receive 3% of the increment to cover admin. After the developer would be reimbursed, then the city would retain 100% with the opportunity to reimburse the city for public development costs, street utility improvements, in order to assist that development in that district. These are long-term projections. It is uncertain once you establish it, the exact timing, but given the current assumptions and subject to final negotiations, that the developer would be repaid in a shorter term than the full duration. A future city council would have an option at that point to say, well, we just want to end this district and enjoy that tax base sooner and forego that future increment to reimburse the city. But there is projected to be the opportunity that the city would have about $2 million present value to reimburse itself for public development costs. The analysis of the request for assistance, so you've heard me use this word proposed, based upon current market conditions, and this is always a finding for any district, the project as proposed would not happen solely through private investment in the reasonably foreseeable future. Doesn't mean that nothing would ever happen on a piece of property. You as council, when and if you pass these resolutions with TIF, you're making the finding that this project is not feasible without tax increment assistance. Decision, as I won't read it, the last point is the opposite. If you decide that, in your opinion, after receiving information from staff and your advisors determine that, in your opinion, it would go forward regardless, then you would vote no to establish a TIF district. Specific to the item on your agenda later this evening on the analysis of the request for the assistance, for any TIF district, it's not simply to provide additional return to a developer for a project. It's about public benefit. What is the public receiving for benefit in return for that assistance? Using the Downtown West as an example, a catalyst for development in Downtown West, this being the first major project in that area that the city has been planning for well over a decade, that is supportive of that whole finding, that but for this assistance. Well-designed building constructed out of high quality material, but for the assistance allowing for that, and an expansion of housing choices in Victoria, emphasizing this is proposed to be a redevelopment district, not a housing district, but it will be supportive of housing. Last one, and again, I'm not meaning to focus on these numbers to illustrate. When a TIF district is being considered, there's always a plan that is prepared, and the developer provides a pro forma on their projected source and use. This example is specific to the Anderson application in proposed TIF 1-8. As proposed, the developer would be paying the city for the land, for the special assessments, and they would be acquiring private property. This will be proposed to be, I use that term pay-go at the beginning of my presentation. Pay-go simply means that the city is not proposing, or staff is not proposing to the city council to issue any bonds, general obligation bonds supported by TIF. Instead, the assistance would be provided on a pay-go basis as the developer pays, the project pays its real estate taxes twice a year under terms of an agreement with the developer. The city would write a check and reimburse those costs solely from the tax increment. It is not a general obligation pledge of the city, and that term pay-go is used for that reason. Pay taxes, get reimbursed up to an agreed to amount in order for the project to be feasible. We also look, and again, I'm not trying to focus on the numbers here, but illustrate a point. Professionals like myself, in reviewing these applications on behalf of cities, look at a developer's return, debt service coverage with and without tax increment financing assistance in order to support that recommendation in informing the city council decision on whether a project would be feasible without tax increment financing assistance. So this is just another piece of information that goes to informing the city council's decision on when and if to establish a TIF district and what amount of assistance is needed in order to make a project feasible. And again, we focus on cash return, debt service coverage, and looking in detail at the developer's pro forma. Analysis of a request for assistance. Construction cost is at about at one point in time. Construction costs are continually changing, but at a point in time when the developer made application, approximately $315,000 per unit. I would note that that does not equate to taxable market value. That is the developer's estimated construction cost. The county assessor determines, based upon comparable properties and projects, what taxable market value is. We find that in the application specific to Downtown West, that the rental assumptions are reasonable, the operating expense assumptions are reasonable. The developer debt service coverage, in our opinion, would not be at a level that would be feasible for the project to secure that funding. And the cash-on-cash return, we also find to be reasonable with that tax increment financing assistance. Not the increment for the full 26 years, but that $3.8 million reimbursement of costs. So summary of considerations. Tonight, you're not considering the agreement with the developer. You are considering the establishment of the TIF district. The establishment of the TIF district will allow for negotiations to be finalized with the developer. And at a later date, estimated to be in September, the city council will be asked to consider a development agreement. And the term development agreement, we often think of planning. This is a development agreement related to the tax increment financing assistance and the terms within. These amounts that you see in the 3.8 million that I've referenced and the 2.1 for public improvements, those are still preliminary numbers. Those have been the framework for the discussion with the developer for almost a year now, including prior discussions. But just note, you are not being asked to approve those specifics tonight. It's simply considering the establishment of the TIF district and the budget that is within. With that, Mayor, Council, I through that quickly. I'm guessing you may have questions, but do note that during your regular meeting, we will give an abbreviated version of this specific to that application.
Terrific. Thank you, Ms. Omdahl. Council, questions? It was a great overview. I'm going to start with the one that I have. Because, and it's specific to the Downtown West project, but because it has that contiguous piece of property that we are redeveloping, that's the property that actually makes this available for TIF. Is that correct?
That is correct. So if it was just green space, it would not qualify for a redevelopment TIF district.
Does that, it could qualify for a housing if we put affordable housing TIF. That property or other portions of that 13.5 acres could qualify for a housing TIF, an affordable housing TIF.
Potentially. It would require a proposal from a developer that would meet those income criteria.
Got it. Council, questions? Yeah, Councilmember Black, please.
So the TIF is 26, but the developer is only 15, is that it?
Proposed. So there's not an
Proposed.
agreement before you this evening, and those discussions are still ongoing. But the framework for over a year now has been that 3.8 million in 15-year term. But that could change.
Okay, so when when it was decided to go in this direction, did we look at, I don't understand why we're not taking 10%, which is what we're allowed, or if we looked into the pooling, how did we decide to go this way?
Good question. The reason that the 3%, I won't go back to that, is meant to reimburse admin costs related to administering the district, annual reporting, staff time. Those costs are not at the level of 10% of the increment. So in discussions with staff and the developer, the concept of amortizing that repayment to the developer sooner in order to pay off that note as soon as possible, recognizing the city doesn't have 10% of the equivalent TIF.
Okay.
Mayor, council member, to clarify, and I may be assuming something that you would understand, you can't just keep 10% and use it. It has to be actual costs incurred for the administration of the district. So that's a distinguishing factor. If the city could just keep 10% and put it into the general fund, for example, then it would make sense. It would be a source of revenue. That is not the case. It has to be actual costs incurred to administer the district.
Okay, and then what about the pooling?
The pooling may be relevant here. The 3.8 million, or the, let me just say, reimbursement to the developer for cost of that project is not subject to pooling. The additional amount that the city, as proposed and what I outlined there, the 2.7, potentially some of that may be subject to pooling, depending on, pooling is twofold. You have 5 years to incur or spend the increment from that district within the boundaries of the district. After 5 years, increment that you may retain and you haven't spent or entered into contracts is subject to pooling. So big picture, what I want you to, in response to your question, some of that 2.7 million may be spent under the pooling requirements. But at this point, it's too early to determine until the city has actually identified the public improvement costs that the city wants to use any of that increment to cover.
Okay, so pooling, by pooling, you mean pooling it with another TIF district? Money generated from another TIF district in Victoria?
Great question, Mayor. Pooling is a very technical term under state law. The answer is not pooling with another district. State law is such that the legislature wants authorities and cities to spend increment as soon as possible and decertify these districts. Therefore, under law, you have 5 years to either spend or commit those dollars. Otherwise, you are limited to retaining 25% of the increment that's generated. The other 75% would need to be used to meet in-district obligations that's satisfied that 5-year window, or the city returns that increment to the county for redistribution to the taxing districts. So that 5-year is really the trigger point that causes for a specific district to be subject to that general term of pooling. It gets very technical and a little bit confusing. So from my response, if you can just take away, you really got 5 years to spend or commit those dollars. Otherwise, you will be very limited into the use. My understanding of the facts for this district, and having worked on it for a long time, the pooling limitation is not going to be a concern for the city council because of the project costs that you are planning for, as well as the projected terms for assistance with the developer. So I don't see pooling be a limiting factor for this particular district.
Got it.
Okay, and then,
Councilmember Black.
I still have notes. Taxable market value, annual growth assumption at 1%. During the flats, it was 1.5%. Why did it go down?
To be a little bit more conservative on that is why it went down. We don't know over a 26-year term. Some cities choose to do 0 on their TIF districts, so we think that 1% is a reasonable compromise. That may be feedback that you could give during the public hearing or when you consider the regular agenda. But note that if you wanted to change that, there's still time, but it would require us to then not have you approve that district. So in response, I think the 1% is a reasonable assumption for this district. It is less than it was prior, and the reason is should be a little bit more conservative in the total amount of increment projected.
Okay, and, all right, thank you. And then on the land acquisition and the special cities assessments, is that paid to us directly, or is that included in the TIF?
As proposed to be negotiated, that would be paid up front. So that'll be a TIF eligible cost for that $3.8 million reimbursement to the developer. When the city receives that payment, those are not considered TIF dollars. Those dollars can be deposited into, well, the special assessment to reimburse for costs, but for the land purchase, those dollars can be deposited into the general fund or any city fund.
Okay, and let's see.
Mayor, Council, and Councilmember Black, as you're looking for your notes, on that land acquisition, that's an example too. Those dollars can be used to help city pay for infrastructure that needs to be built out and to reduce bonding. But those are you don't need to make that decision tonight. Those are a lot of options that you will have.
Okay. And then, let's see. Yeah, the pooling, I still, when I looked it up, it said, may use to finance activities outside the TIF district, but within the development district, which, would that be the entire district?
For Victoria, your development district number 1, which is what this TIF district 1-8 is being established within, is coterminous with the boundaries of the city. So it can be spent, 25% of the increment could be spent on redevelopment within the boundaries of the city.
That's what I
But going back to my earlier comment, for this district in particular, you have enough qualifying costs that are going to be subject to pooling most likely. But to answer your question, Councilmember Black, as a matter of policy, you are correct that that could be spent. What's confusing in the law, it isn't just geographic area. Once you get past that first 5 years of the district, if you have not spent or incurred those costs, any contracts that you would enter into to use that increment even within the boundaries of the district are subject to that same limitation. So you'd have 25% of the increment. So now I'm speaking more in generalities. Again, I don't believe anything that I'm talking about that's specific to pooling is going to be relevant to TIF District 1-8, just given the facts for that particular project.
Because it is currently undeveloped and there's so many that we need to do streets and other infrastructure and that kind of thing, so that those dollars could be used for those purposes.
Correct.
Got it.
Okay, I'm okay for now.
Good.
Thank you.
Councilmember Gunderson, please.
Usage of TIF is basically to prevent communities from sitting on that money and not use it the way it's intended to be used. That's why cities go into, if I'm correct, or if I'm understanding this correctly, go into it with a plan to utilize those TIF funds to create the infrastructure that's needed for the level of impact that new residents would create. But for any other reason, we would not be able to do those improvements without the TIF. Correct. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, TIF is not, in Minnesota at least, it's not that you just decide, we're going to create a TIF district here because we want to capture some increment because we may want to use it. It's very project specific, and the findings that but for that assistance, a project would not go forward.
And that's why we have a plan to go forward. And that's why the pooling isn't falling into this. We're not running up against a pooling issue because we've got a plan to create and spend those funds on the infrastructure needed.
Correct.
Councilmember Roberts, please.
I just want to make sure because TIF does tend to get complicated, right, and all the rules. You mentioned, right, there's the housing TIF district, right, which is for affordable housing, my understanding is. So would this, if we created the TIF district that we're talking about, does that preclude, so if we did have a developer on the 13 acres that wanted to bring in affordable housing, would that preclude us from doing something like that in the future?
No, it does not. That would be a separate standalone district. For a housing district, you need a developer that agrees to annually or semi-annually income qualify a certain percentage of tenants.
Great question. Council, other questions? Good. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I think we don't have any other things on our agenda this evening. So this was informational, so no action is needed. And there are no more items to come before the body at the workshop. So we are going to adjourn the workshop and we will start our council meeting at 6:30. So may I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned.